Today, designing modern board games based on George Philly's forthcoming book, A Class in Board Game Design. Lecture 1, Introduction, Properties of All Games. I am Professor Phillies, and this course is IMGD 2500, Design of Tabletop Strategy Games. The objective of this course is to march you through all of the things you need to do to learn how to design a game, and in the end, groups of you, groups to protect my sanity since I can't possibly grade 30 games in the available time, are going to design a tabletop game. To support that, there are all sorts of things going on. First of all, there are 2 textbooks. These are the first edition books. The second edition are available on Amazon Kindle, and they're available at smashwords.com. These are available both from Third Millennium. These are paperback. The Kindle ones are electronic. You can find them under my name on Amazon Kindle or Smashwords. If you hunt, you will find on television, on YouTube, the George Phillies channel, and you can find a videotape of this course as it was offered in a past year. The course has been changed somewhat. In addition to the 2 books, there is a third book. It's on your syllabus, Stalingrad for Beginners, which will be your introduction to a type of game that most of you have never seen, let alone played, which is a hex and counter board war game. Now, the point of showing you a game unlike most that you have ever seen is that this is interactive media and game development. A large fraction of you are going to be interacting with war-related games. There is a huge amount of material on how you design military games. They're called hex and counter games, and very little of that seems to have penetrated to other people. I will be sending you will be the alpha testers, I will be sending you, as soon as it's finished, my new book, Designing Board War Games, Introduction, which will talk much more about that. Okay, so I said there are 2 books. There are also some games. In particular, over the course of the term, you're going to be playing Carcassonne. You're going to be playing Puerto Rico. The current working plan is that you will be playing Vanished Planet, and then you will be playing either Conquest of the Fallen Lands or Brass. And this will get you up through the first 4 laboratories. When I say laboratory, I mean laboratory in the physics sense. Yes, it's a laboratory. That means there will be lab reports. There will be analytical thinking as to what you're doing. I'm not just having you play games so you play them. You're learning how to do something very important known as play testing. Play testing is how you get a game that's any good. Of course, the playtesters, when they play, may give you various sorts of feedback, like the rules make no sense, the board is unreadable, or the ominous message, where is the game here? One of the classic failures of computer game developments is huge amounts of artwork, vast, brilliant coding, and then you ask, where is the game? Why is this even vaguely interesting? Important question. And that will take us to the last 2 things, well, more or less the last 2 things, maybe it's really 3 things you're going to need for the course. So I said they're going to be games. I said they're books. There is also a software piece. And the software piece is what will let you play the game, the hex and counter game we were talking about. The software, it's on the syllabus, is either Sun Tzu from zunsu.com, Vassal from vassalengine.org, or if you get desperate, There's always Cyberboard. They're all perfectly good. My endorsement of Sun Tzu is that it has the prettiest graphics. However, it's the PC-oriented. Those of you with some of those other systems may have to go elsewhere. If all else fails, you can buy the whole thing from Camelot Games. But I'm giving you the software variation. Oh yes, I did say 3 books. The 3 books will cost you less than the sales tax on some freshman physics books. I know how not spending money will break your hearts. I did say you'll be playing 4 games, but those are games for groups of 4 people. So you form your design groups, and each of you buy one of the 4 games. I would, however, urge you to get off the ground and buy them so you have something to do this Wednesday. And I have been sending you emails about this. Hopefully you were paying attention. There are 2 more pieces in the game here, and one is something called a design notebook. And the notion of the design notebook is that you are thinking about things, and you are trying to be creative, and like Leonardo da Vinci, you put your thoughts into notebooks so if you have written them down, and when you want to find something in a week or 2, you don't have to try to remember it, it's there. The design notebooks will be collected and graded at the end of the course. No notebook, no pass. It's very simple. Ditto, the objective of the course is to try to develop a game. Now, truthfully, we are going to go through the steps, the development steps. One of the things that happens if you develop is that you come to the realization, this is a dead end, we should set it aside. That's fine. That's a positive outcome if you figure out everything is perfect about this game, except it's so boring that the playtesters always fall asleep. That's a fine outcome. It'd be nice if it were a better game, but from the standpoint if you have 7 weeks to get done, figuring out that something didn't work and why is an adequate outcome. Not producing a game is not an adequate outcome. Okay, so I've sort of described some of the pieces. Oh yes, game. Let me go back to the design notebook idea. How many of you are in the art track? Hands? Okay. Those of you in the art track will already have heard this unto death almost. The rest of you may not. You're going to be judged on your portfolio and your thinking. And so if your sketches and your ideas show a few bits from different courses, well, if the few bits show that you were a painter like Raphael, you'll be in good shape. But if they don't show that you're interested in art and design beyond what you absolutely had to do to get your clock stamped in the course, that isn't good. On the other hand, if I look in, and here is a sketch beautifully pasteled in, and it's a fallen leaf on the ground, and here is the second view of the fallen leaf. It's from underneath. And that's the one where you can see that it's the micro mecha with turret and treads and coil gun and all sorts of other neat stuff. But it's carefully designed as a leaf because it's a very small micro mecha. And that's what shows you that you love your work and are going places. Design notebooks are very good. My good friend, the late Sid Saxon, some of you have played some of his games like Acquire, who was the greatest American board game designer of all times, kept notebooks for every year of his life. They had meta tags attached to each entry. There was an index in the back so he could look up the meta tags and see which page to look on. That's what a good design notebook is. It's a very important skill to acquire. Okay, so we are going to talk about game design. Supporting that, there are 2 books. One of the books, which second edition is Designing Modern Strategy Games, is supposed to help you assemble pieces of ideas that you would actually want to use in designing. So there's an essay by Greg Kostikian, famous game designer. There's one in each of the 2 books. You're going to read both of them. They're supposed to be educational. His message, and one of them is, don't be a vidiot. Don't be someone who thinks that game is synonymous with first-person shooter with lots of blood and gore. There is much more to gaming than that, and the people who know this are going to do much better in the future than the people who aren't. In addition, what we try to do is to sort out, well, what are the pieces and topics and elements that go into a game? What do you have in a game? There are lots of different types of games. What do we have that says this is a game, this is not a game? And that is his other essay. And his other essay is, I have no words and I must design. Does anyone recognize the short story that title comes from?
I have no, is it face or mouth and I must scream?
I have no mouth and I must scream, correct. Well, and that's an illustration of a very important part of design. In the words of Pablo Picasso, great geniuses do not borrow. They steal everything good they find, and that's how you do well. Bunches of you, especially the folks in the tech track, are going to be wondering, well, this is very nice, but why should I be studying board games? Why shouldn't I just be studying computer games? And there is an answer to this. It's an answer I will phrase more for the folks in the art track because it's easier to explain. Suppose I want to become a great painter, ignoring my actual technical skills. What do? Well, I study fabrics and glass blowing and typography and perspective and lighting. I study all sorts of things. And when I say I study fabric, I find out how fabric folds, how it falls, and in the end, I can walk in and do at least an imitation of a French Academy portrait. How many of you know what French Academy is? It's a school of art. Oh, good. French Academy, brilliantly realistic. The fabric is so well done, you can feel it just by looking at it. The opposite of French Academy is comic book superhero. The way we can tell it's the opposite is that every so often at a comic convention, a company with lots of money to bomb the problem with tries to costume a few people, male, female, whatever, in superhero costumes so you can actually meet Batman, Superman, Supergirl, whoever. And they make this interesting discovery. Those costumes are really hard to get to work, no matter how much spandex you throw at the problem. They don't fold right, they don't flop right, they don't conform to body contours properly because the people drawing them never studied human anatomy the way they needed to. That's why you study everything, and because you've studied everything, the part you want to do, which for a lot of you is game development, works. Of course, I could go on like this for many, many hours. The point of saving you from this is buried in the other book, Modern Perspectives. And Modern Perspectives are interviews done by my co-author, Tom Vazel, with 29 more or less leading game designers. And their opinions, many of which do not agree with each other, on how you should do game design and how you should think about game. I suppose the best advice for board game designers is don't quit your day job. For computer gamers, it's quite different because the industry is much bigger. So we have this vast stack of material we're going to throw at you. To get you to think about it, they're going to be writing assignments. There are 2 points to the writing assignments. The first one is, I want you actually to read the stuff in the books and see that you've done it. So you're going to write stuff that shows you've thought about it. I'm really mean, aren't I? The second point is, you're going to be doing game design. At the moment it's board games, but at some time it's going to be perhaps specifications for a computer game. It's going to be reports. And it is actually critical that you be able to write fluently in standard edited grammatical English. So when I'm correcting these, you will discover that I am correcting your grammar. For some of you, this is completely unimportant because you learned how to write in high school. For some of you, it's rather more important. If any of you are not native speakers of English, do let me know, and I will make reasonable allowances Writing is very important. You're going to be doing a lot of it. Okay, so that sort of takes us to what is in the course. The one thing I did not emphasize, you're going to be designing a game. What does that mean? Well, at some point you're going to have map board, components, parts that move, all sorts of things, and you're going to have at least a rough draft, and you're going to present it to the alpha testers. This is called play testing. And the alpha testers are going to give you a report back. Now, in the real world, schedules can be a little tricky, and getting people to respond on time can be tricky. This is an academic course. We have 28 lectures, 7 weeks to finish, and therefore, when we say the test panel version of the game will be done on date X, it's not a, it would be nice if it was done on date X. It is a serious failure if it is not done on date X, and each design group is collectively responsible for seeing that it is done. I have occasionally had design groups that, this person is doing the unit counters, and now we come up to playtest day, and that person is no place in sight, and neither are the unit counters needed to play the game. You want to do better than that. It's one of these things because we're on a tight schedule. There is a tight schedule. You will be held to it. Okay. I am now sort of done with discussing grading. Sometimes when I discuss grading, I come down with being a little firm and negative, and it's a matter that a few people in the classroom will probably need it, and it's nice to get this out of the way at the front end so I can be nice and cheery the rest of the term. Hopefully none of you will duplicate the student group a few years ago. And here is the final. And one of the questions on the final was, and will be, who are the members of your design group? What did you each do? What worked in your game? And one of the persons said, the three of us tested it very vigorously and the game was absolutely perfect. And the second person said, I kept telling my lab partners that we really needed to try play testing the game once, and they said I was wrong. And the third person would have said, I dropped this course after week 2, except that was true, and therefore he wasn't there to take the final. The playtest reports made it very clear that the lack of playtesting meant that the game was a perfect example of what not to do in game design. Okay, so having said this, there are a couple of fragments I want to add, and one is something of a comment on what game you will be designing. Now, I've tried the variation where I just say, go out and design a game. And I received 5 or 10 totally different games. One of them, this goes back a few years, was a marvelous beauty because the person had learned how to use CAD/CAM programs, learned how to use a programmable milling machine, and produced this beautiful stack of lucite pieces, each about this thick, that's stacked into a tower, except it was not a simple tower, it was complicated shapes. It was absolutely gorgeous, and the unit counters were the same way. The people who had designed a hex and counter board wargame were totally baffled by what the rules meant and what they were trying to do, and vice versa. So what I'm going to do is to say I'm going to specify in fair detail what sort of a game you are to design. Except my specifications are probably not going to match your thoughts on what is a game. If I tell you I am designing a game, what do I say? It's not going to match that. Let me also say, it is not I want you all to design my favorite game so I get to play it. My favorite game is something called Tactics Pi, which none of you have ever seen or are ever likely to see. Yeah, I collect board war games. I have the largest collection in the world by 50%, at least. In any event, having said that, What are the specifications on the game? Well, it has to have some pieces. It must have an exploration element. Now, that's defined very broadly. It doesn't have to be explorers in the wilderness. Exploration means you don't know what's there, like you don't know what the market is for your goods until you get there. It must have an economic element, multi-level. You'll find out what that means as the course goes on. And these things are actually in the list. Okay, it must have strong player interaction. In principle, you can design a game that satisfies all of the other things I'm going to say, except that if the players were deaf and dumb, could not communicate, and just waved a card at each other occasionally to show where you were in the turn sequence, you'd have a game. No, I want something with strong player interaction. Puerto Rico, which you're going to play, by the way, how many of you have played Puerto Rico? Hands? Okay, a few of you. Has very little player interaction, if you think about it. It's very peculiar in that respect. Strong player interaction. It is going to be cooperative, competitive. Cooperative means there is a joint victory condition that everyone put together has to satisfy or everyone loses. When you get to Vanished Planet, you will be playing a purely competitive game. You are one side. The creature that is trying to eat the galaxy is the other side. The creature that is attempting to eat the galaxy has this extremely simple-minded strategy based on marching straight ahead, eating everything in its path. So you could actually have a paper AI. That's cooperative, but it's also competitive because you would like to identify which person has won. So those are conditions. Oh, yes. We would like a tech tree. Now, tech is defined very, very broadly. You might say it's steam engines, electric motors, nuclear reactors, or you might say it's sleep, obscuration, fireball. You can tell which edition of D&D I played 40 years ago. But a tech tree. Now, what other specifications am I going to put on? This is all in the syllabus you have, by the way. Oh, yes. No military, crime, hunting, intelligent animals. The reason I am setting this down is not that I am a pacifist of some sort. I'm not. I'm prior service Army. The reason I am setting this down is that experience has shown that people who start sticking these things in drop into the mindset of, this is really a first-person shooter. And having dropped into that mindset, they attempt to turn first-person shooter into this. It just doesn't work well. It's not there's something wrong with it. It's we have seen the experiment and it just didn't work. Oh yes, intelligent trees are right out too. That was a real game. It was actually a good game, but it didn't turn out quite as well as it might have. So having said that, think of yourself, if you're designing the game, not as Napoleon conquers the world, but as Bill Gates purchases the world. Clear distinction here. Well, I have sort of said what the design project is. There is a schedule in your handout, and that is to be viewed as a totally strict schedule. Okay, if your entire design group comes down with the plague or something, we will have to work around this. But up to this sort of issue, we are going to go ahead. Okay, so in any event, I have described to you the design group. I have described to you the the sorts of things we're doing. Oh yes, there's one last question you might ask about this. Given all those rules, why aren't we doing this as a board game? Why aren't we doing this as a computer game? And there are two parts to that. And the first part is, I'm trying to broaden your consciousness to realize there are other types of games with all sorts of ideas in them, and if you borrow those ideas, you will become a better computer game, serious game, interactive media designer. The other reason is, board games have no code. It is impossible to spend weeks and weeks wondering why is it that when you press start on the game, the first thing it does is to totally erase the hard disk. This is viewed as a negative outcome in computer games. Well, there is no code, so you don't have to worry about that. The other issue is the art part is kept to a minimum. Now, if people do beautifully painted unit counters, that's positive. And there will be several art problems as we go, but we're trying to focus on design. And board games, you can't sell the code, there isn't any. You can't sell the pretty pictures very much because once you get inside the cover, there's not very much. You have to sell the game itself, the design. So that's why we're doing board games. Okay. Having said that, let us ask a general question. And the general question is, going to go down to a particular statement, elements of games. There are vast numbers of different sorts of games. And you can describe them, and some parts of the description are more important for some games than others. But my current feeling is you can take games and you can break the things that you put into them into about 7 elements. Now, I am using element in a specific sense. Medieval alchemists, medieval Western alchemists said earth, air, fire, water. However, are any of you familiar with Japanese alchemy? 7 elements. The other elements were wood, ceramic, and silk. Now, if you say these are elements, they don't seem to be elements, not carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, plutonium. However, they're states of matter. Solid, liquid, gas, plasma, fire. Wood is a composite. Ceramics are glasses. And silk is a polymer. In lines of that very old movie, plastics, my boy, plastics. Plastics are polymers. So I am going to do 7 elements of game design, one of which is representation. And another of which is theme. And then there is mechanism and style. And those, if you read the first edition book, I tried to separate these, and I finally concluded, no, they just don't want to separate. Shape, voice. I'm up to 5, aren't I? Well, we can keep going a bit, because there are 2 more. And one of them I will call content, and one of them I will call components. So, nice to say there are 7 of these, but what are they? Well, representation is what a naive viewer, someone who doesn't know what they're looking at very much, would say they are looking at. For example, someone would say, look at miniatures gaming, and say, oh, it's someone playing with toy soldiers. The toy soldiers are a representation. Or they would look at medieval recreationists having at with padded swords and say, oh, it's, or they would look at people dressed up as Civil War soldiers shooting at each other with blanks and say, oh, it's recreationist, it's live action. And I could go down the list, and those are sort of representations. Theme is what happens if I ask you, well, what are you designing a game about? And the answer you would get, typical answer, I'm designing a game about pirates and vampires and zombies. And if you think about this, it sounds like I've given you a lot of information, but there's absolutely no clue what it looks like, what the rules are, or anything. Theme is the coloring you put on top to make it interesting. The opposite of theme is themelessness. Chess is themeless. I mean, nominally it's medieval warfare, but they didn't fight wars like that. Let me give you an example of theme. It is likely that a couple of you will recognize the game I'm describing. If you do, please hold your peace until I get to the end. So we will consider the fantastic game, Conquer the Internet. It's about internet hacking. And since the internet is a little large these days, the internet has been abstracted to a square of little squares. And it's a contest between the COBOL Hacker Supreme and the Fortran Hacker Supreme. And they each put little colored tiles down on the little squares. Accountant green for the COBOL Hacker Supreme, IBM blue for the Fortran Hacker Supreme, and they are trying to take over the board. However, the little squares represent computer programs. And the computer programs have a certain feature, maybe it's a bug. If the computer program sees there is a neighboring uninfected computer, meaning one of the four neighboring squares is blank, it's happy. If it sees it's next to another program of its type that is next to a square that can still be infected, it's still happy. But if it looks around in all directions and all it sees is the edge of the board or enemy pieces so that we're totally surrounded and we have no chance to infect any new computers, it becomes very unhappy and deletes itself. Poor computer program. So you follow you sort of see what the rules are, and therefore you're trying to surround areas. And of course, if this is a Fortran square, and this is a Fortran square, and this is a Fortran square, and these are open, and the COBOL Hacker Supreme places one of his pieces here like this, the poor COBOL program sees it's surrounded by IBM blue and the edge of the board, and deletes itself. On the other hand, if this was a COBOL piece, and this was a COBOL piece, and this is a COBOL piece, and the COBOL Hacker Supreme plays there, this Fortran program is now surrounded by the wrong color, and it goes away. You have now heard the rules. Yes, there's a special rule. There's a situation in which you could get into the equivalent of chess perpetual check. And there is a special rule for dealing with what would otherwise be the game keeps running in a circle and never goes anyplace. We'll skip that one, but there is one. Okay, you now have heard all of the rules. Oh, how big is the internet? Well, there are a lot of computers on it these days, but I would guess that something that's 17 or 19 squares by 17 or 19 squares, that's almost as big as the internet, isn't it? Okay, you have now heard all the game rules. And it's a computer hacking game. Does this game sound as if it is shallow, meaning the strategies are going to be very simple? Or does it sound, be two fingers up, deep, the strategies are going to be very difficult? I want everyone to think about this. You've heard the rules, and you're going to make an estimate of whether the game is shallow. Oh my, we'd better make sure that our brothers and sisters play it before they turn 8, or they're going to be complaining that we give them stupid kids' games. Or is it really deep that you could maybe develop strategies for it? So everyone think. Hands. Lots of 2s. Okay, how many of you, except for the weird theme, recognized the game? And what game is it?
It's Go, right?
Yes, it's Go. It's the Japanese game of Go. It is a game so deep that efforts to write computer program AIs to play it mostly don't work. But I rethemed it. That's what theme is. Theme, by the way, tells you nothing about the rules. Oh, let's do the rest of these. Shape. Shape is how much space the game occupies in your life. And so I'm simply going to name two extremes. We'll talk more about shape later. Scissors, paper, rocks. I am standing here, you're standing there, and we count to 3 or whatever and wave fingers at each other. That's it. One person won, one person lost. Very simple-minded. Let's go to the other extreme. It's a hex and counter board war game. Actually, I'll do two of them. And one of them is Campaign for North Africa. The game has about 5,000 unit counters. It has logistics rules where you have to move the supplies around by hand. A reasonable team to play each side is about 5 players, 1 or 2 of whom are good accountants who may have written spreadsheet programs to support this. And you figure it's 100 or 200 playing hours over a prolonged period. There are people who've played it to completion. We could also consider War in the Pacific, which is the decision games game. Let's put it this way. There are little unit counters, just like they're chess pieces. But chess has a wimpy 32 pieces. The Pacific game has 9,000, many of which are on the board at the same time. You notice there's just difference in scale. That's what shape is. Voice is the literary voice. Have you ever, well, actually almost all of you must know what voice is, because when I said first person, how many of you know what I mean by first person shooter? Hands. Now some of you may be thinking abomination, invention of Satan, devoid of merit, but you know what I mean. On the other hand, so that's first person, singular even. On the other hand, let us consider, I'll just do one of these. You come to a peasant's hut. It's barely large enough for one man to lie down flat. You open the door. There in front of you is a 30-foot wide, brilliantly illuminated, inlaid with gold and jewels, marble staircase leading up. You see this, and you must decide what to do. That's second person. Well, there are a whole bunch of persons out there. We'll talk about that some other time. Mechanism and style. Game mechanics are the pieces of rules that you assemble to build a game. So, for example, a game mechanic is tile laying. If you were playing dominoes or Carcassonne, you have some object, you put it down, that's tile laying. A game mechanic is trick-taking. So if you are playing bridge, you have cards, you each have a card, you display the card, the person with the best card wins the trick. Poker is also trick-taking, though poker players tend not to think of it that way, some of them. That's a game mechanic. However, there are lots of game mechanics. Bidding, you have an auction. You have something you have, like money. You have something you want. You have competitors who want it too. And you bid against each other. Now, bidding could be a very small piece of the total. For example, Victory in the Pacific, World War II game, in the standard tournament, you get to bid victory points. The person who bids more victory points gets the Japanese side. The Japanese side is favored, but not after you've given away so many victory points. That's bidding. But the game is fairly large and complicated, not as large as the decision games game, and therefore the bidding mechanic is a little piece. On the other hand, there's masterpiece or auctioneering. There are several games out there where it's all bidding. It's all about you want to get things, and there's such amusing things as you keep bidding your opponent up. He doesn't know which paintings you want. And you keep bidding your opponent up, And at some point you stop bidding and they're stuck with their overpriced bid. That's a bidding game, but it is the bidding, the auction has become the style. It is the style because it dominates play. But can you really sort out which are mechanisms and which are styles? If you get my first edition book, Design Elements, you'll find I try to do that. And in the second edition book, I still try to do it. But by this time, I've sort of given up as to whether I can do that or not. Components. Components is what falls out of the box when you open the box and turn it upside down. That's components. And components can be maps, pawns, little pieces of paper, charts, dice, spinners. You have an arrow, you hit the arrow, it runs in a circle, it gives you a result, sort of. Cards. There are all sorts of things you could find in boxes. Cube towers. Some of these things are three-dimensional. Now, it used to be that if you wanted a three-dimensional component, price infinity. But under modern conditions, especially if you know how to do a little CAD/CAM, you can run your design through a 3D printer, and if you aren't too picky about how mechanically stable the thing is and you're gentle with it, you can have a three-dimensional piece that does all these neat things. So that's components. The last one is content. Content is, well, we have this distinguished gentleman standing here. And if you look carefully at the distinguished gentleman, he is not dressed the way people you would meet typically in the street are dressed, because he is dressed as would be a gentleman of, Regency or a little later England, complete with vest and suit, and that is actually a necktie, but not the way you would think of neckties. And he is holding a little gadget in one hand, and if you look very carefully at the little gadget, which you'll have to do afterwards, you'll realize that it is a reasonable representation of a Watt as opposed to a Newcomen steam engine. And so you have all of these things that you put in that are part of play that you developed from someplace. Or we have here is Puerto Rico, and there are ships, and they appear to have masts or hoists, and they have people walking up them, and they have cranes loading things. And if you ask, is this colonial Puerto Rico at the time? No, at that time they used wooden sailing ships. But it's very pretty to look at, and it adds color to the game. The importance of content depends a great deal on what sort of game you're developing. For example, if you're trying to do a board war game on the German invasion of Russia in 1941, you're going to want a list of all of the military units and their identification numbers. So here's the 56th Armored Corps, and the 39th Armored Corps, and the 6th SS Armored Corps, and all of these unpleasant people about to do hideous crimes against humanity. But you have their names, and you have how many soldiers were in them, how much artillery they had, how many tanks they had, and you need all that information to construct what you claim is a historically accurate board war game. So in some branches of game design, content can be very important. If I said, we're going to do a game about pirates, well, that's one of the things I kind of excluded because that somehow implies violence. We're going to do a game about, there's sailing ships. And if you want to do historical research, well, on one hand, you might rent a copy of Cutthroat Island, which has good real sailing ships, or you might rent a copy of Pirates of the Caribbean, never mind. On the other hand, you could purchase a copy of Harlan's Seamanship, which will tell you in some hundreds of pages exactly how to sail a square-rigged sailing ship, including all of the neat things you cannot do with motor-powered ships, like sailing due backwards and sailing due sideways, which you could do with a square rigger. And you turn all of these pages into, say, 10 pages of rules on how to turn a ship across the wind. How many of you know how to sail? Oh, okay. Well, if you have a sailboat, and we are sailing this way, and the wind is coming from over there, if it's got triangular sails, you put the rudder over, and the ship pivots very quickly. You can't sail due upwind with a normal sailboat. And you come over to over here, and you're sailing again. That is called tacking. If you try to tack a square rigger, it's much trickier unless you want to get stuck with the ship facing due that way, being pushed due backwards by the wind, and great difficulty turning the ship into a direction where it will sail normally. So I have now sat here and I have described the 7 elements of games: representation, theme, shape, mechanism and style, voice, content, and components. What we're going to do in the next few lectures is alternate between discussing these issues, so you have some idea of what you could put into your own game, and actually building you up so you can play and play test a board game. Why are we going to play test? Well, come Wednesday, we're going to play Carcassonne, and you're first going to play it with the normal rules, and then I'm going to give you a rules variation. And you're going to play the rules variation in the normal game, and the lab report will ask, well, that's very interesting, which gives you the better game. However, I have run us out of time, so we are done for the day.